Um, I'll give a little introductions before we start
Mhm.
for that. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining with us to Ecological Urbanism Talk. This is a part of the 2020 UE Visiting Professorship Program conducted by the Department of Architecture. And my name is Alita, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. So today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Julie Nichols as our speaker. Julie is a lecturer in architecture and sustainable design programs at the University of South Australia. Her main research interest is linked to the fields of urban history and theory, urban cartography, and urban design through drawings and representation practices. Julie is the founder of Vernacular Knowledge Research Group, or FKRG, established since 2017. And now, for today's lecture, we will explore the ideas proposed through the movement of ecological urbanism 10 years on in the context of the climate emergency and a pandemic. Well, there's several questions that triggers this discussion. One of them is how might we learn from architectural and urban design approaches to realize cities and buildings beyond the notions of the built environment as merely sustainable? And there's a lot more other questions which perhaps can be developed through our discussions today. And that will be very interesting. So now, before we begin, I would like to remind all the participants right now, if you have any questions, you have any comments or any responses, you may write it down in the chat box, or you can directly talk with us, talk to Julie during the Q&A session. I hope so far it's clear. So now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Julie Nichols if you want to present your presentation.
Thank you very much, Alita, and thank you very much to the University of Indonesia again for hosting this forum and giving me the opportunity to talk about, for the third lecture, the climate emergency and the pandemic, and looking at ecological urbanism in 10 years on. So I'm going to share my screen now. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Good. Right, hang on. It's not letting me start from the beginning. Oh. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. There we go. Right. So this is, first of all, a GIF that I got from the internet because I was looking at specifically how architects are looking at climate, taking the climate emergency seriously, and how there's been this advocacy since, in this case, around 2016, that started looking at how architects can be responsive to what is now considered a climate emergency. So I want to sort of use these ideas to start with to launch into the sort of analysis and critique of ecological urbanism. And yeah, as Alita was outlining, the talk today is trying to look at how we might learn from such architectural and urban design approaches to realise cities and buildings beyond the notion of the built environment as merely sustainable, and also how might cities and architectural practitioners actively contribute to a viable ecological future through design interventions at this sort of urban scale. Now, this where I guess I'll start with, where is the sort of story of this climate emergency and action at the moment. So this GIF comes from, as you can see, the source is an illustration for Architect, which was put out on the 5th of October this year. So this is an image to reflect the first climate emergency declaration that was by a constituency of suburban Melbourne architects. And it was an early signal that public opinion on global heating and biodiversity loss had shifted from this sort of feeling of concern to an actual crisis. So architects and built environment professionals around the world have since joined forces since this sort of 2016 movement, and with colleagues as well as youth groups in a global climate movement calling for urgent action and pragmatic solutions to this dilemma. So in recent years, the visibility of these campaigns have intensified, in part due to the release of an alarming 1.5 degree report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was articulated most significantly by young Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. And today, over 1,777 local authorities across 30 nations have declared a climate emergency. Yet, according to the UN Environment Programme's latest global status report, building construction and operations remain the largest carbon dioxide emitters by sector, accounting for 36% of global energy use related to carbon dioxide emissions. So not a lot has changed, even though this climate emergency has been indicated. So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. This is not a politically driven or influenced body. It's supposed to be an independent organisation judging the impact of climate change. So it suggests, this is a statement put out by the IPCC, and all the references are on the slides. So it says human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels, with a likely range of 0.8 to 1.2 degrees Celsius. So global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. And there is a high confidence that this is going to occur. So the IPCC in 2019 put out a special report about the impacts on the ocean and the cryosphere, and now recently the more up-to-date and projective report around climate change into 2022. So the IPCC prepares these comprehensive assessment reports about the state of scientific, technical and socio-economic knowledge on climate change and its impacts and future risks, and options for reducing the rate at which climate change is occurring. So in Australia, I'm going to talk about firstly the Australian situation and why I'm kind of interested in how this sort of fits into my research area to some extent, is that there's an organisation called Architects Declare Australia, and this is what they say on their website. They say that first of all, why is this important to the kind of context of the research that I'm looking at? And I guess there's two main reasons. And one is because my area of vernacular architecture is really based on regenerative principles and around the sustainability of the environment for the vernacular environment, and how traditional communities were able to support their ongoing built development through sustainable practices. So I'm very interested in how our future approach to sustainability through this climate emergency and what we're doing about it will affect future development. And then the second reason I'm very interested is that, again, it comes back to looking and focusing, as this quote suggests, on people or Indigenous people that have lived in Australia for 60,000 years potentially, and endured various different climatic conditions, and how their intangible cultural heritage is useful to analyse to inform the way we move forward in this kind of current context in this climate emergency. So Architects Declare Australia co-founder Ronald Boydell also recognises that 2019 is a tipping point where he witnessed that the construction industry perspectives towards climate action began to shift. So in his words, he says 2019 was timely in terms of other high-profile events, including new legislation passed internationally by the UK government and around emissions of greenhouse gases. So other kind of governments, large polluters, are starting to respond to this climate emergency. And some of the points that the Architects Declare Australia want to do in their addressing of these sorts of conditions are identified here on the slide. I think there's 10 points in total. In addition to these points about raising awareness, advocating for faster change, establishing appropriate mitigation principles for climate and biodiversity, also sharing knowledge and research around what options are available, evaluating new projects to see how they can positively contribute to the environment. And then there's a whole bunch of another 5 principles that the Architects Declare Australia propose for future development, and how architects can potentially impact this issue through appropriate and ethical and moral practice. Excuse me. So this is sort of seen as a way, I mean, it's obviously utopian in many ways, because I guess to start with in the literature, it's seen as a sort of a paradox that architects have to lobby their client around sustainable development or development at all, like perhaps opting for adaptive reuse of existing structures rather than new build structures. So this is sort of affecting change in architectural practice, and I think that's a really important thing for future architects to note. Now, I'm sort of drawing in a whole bunch of examples to show how this idea of climate emergency and the pandemic all come into play in this whole narrative of what can we do with our urban environments in 2020 and beyond. So the Venice Biennale, which did not go ahead this year because of the pandemic, has now got a proposition for 2021, and the example I'm going to show here is an exhibition hosted by what is her name? Olga Subiros, and she's an architect, and she looks at a whole bunch of ways of representing the impacts on the city of this climate emergency. And not because representation is our thing as architects, drawings and images, and that's how we show impact and how we communicate ideas to our clients. Her work is communicating to the people that come to look at her exhibition what the impacts these sorts of forces are having on our cities. Now, in this example, this is called the Cartography of Barcelona, and it's redrawn to represent air pollution. And the hotspots, if you like, or the more densely affected areas of the city are indicated in the sort of hazy black and grey areas. Now, this is really interesting because this is really coming out of what ecological urbanism proposed early on, and before that landscape urbanism proposed, is representing information about the city from translating large data sets, so statistics, into a representation. And this is very much what this example does. So here, now this is the kind of scenes around, now I'm trying to connect this climate emergency with the notion of the pandemic. So ironically, because of the pandemic, it has been found that large cities actually suffered less pollution because people weren't on the roads using their cars, public transport, etc. People were in lockdown. So actually air pollution and environmental sort of circumstances improved during the peak of the pandemic in these large cities. So here you can see the image on the left of Barcelona without air pollution, and on the right is the image with air pollution. So this is kind of an interesting thing to reflect upon, because it's so, is this the only way of addressing these sort of significant climate issues by not utilising our urban space in the same way? Obviously, that's just a hypothetical question. So in one way, having a pandemic, which is a health crisis, has cleared up air pollution, but equally the air pollution creates its own health crisis through poor respiratory conditions for its population. So there's a kind of interesting tension in the way the city is used under different pandemic, if you like, conditions. Okay, this representation here is another mapping, and this is looking at, she calls it the maps of vulnerabilities. So basically suggesting that where the sort of denser population of red and yellow dots is that this is, excuse me, this is an area of public space which is really affected by these different health crises from because public space in a way is a coming together of people in Barcelona. It's quite a large population of people, so therefore in the case of COVID means that public space can spread disease, but equally because those areas during the high pollution times of large civic use also means that those are areas of high pollution and affects the health of the population. So all of these are around public health issues. So this is another mapping. Okay, for those of you that don't know, I'm going to now explain this concept of ecological urbanism, reflecting now on those examples that are very much 21st century, 2020, 2021, things that are occurring. And then how does this sort of 2010 concept of ecological urbanism, respond to those sorts of issues? And I'm sort of suggesting that there are ways it can do that. Okay, so the main source that I'm using is the text called Ecological Urbanism, which is this substantial book like this by Mohsen Mostafavi, edited by Mohsen Mostafavi and Gareth Doherty, both from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and it was a publication in 2010. But prior to that, they published a bunch of journal papers earlier around these ideas that they have been looking at in their studio design work. Okay, so from this image, you can see that the proposition is very much converting all vacant tracts of land within proximity of the metropolis or the city into productive farming land. Now, I don't know, again, if I'm kind of going over old territory for you guys, but landscape urbanism by Charles Waldheim is a movement that sort of encouraged ecological urbanism to progress, where that was around the destruction of Detroit once there's a whole bunch of artistic works and publications called Walking Detroit and all those ideas around the post-industrial city when manufacturing moves out of an industrial focused city, and then the city becomes sort of this shell of its former self, where it used to be a really vibrant, interesting and functioning place, but then because the industry moves out to suburban areas, the city becomes this sort of shell. So the movement at that time with landscape and urbanism were in the sort of 1990s, late 1980s, was around how to repopulate the city. And one idea or that has eventuated through a lot of kind of McCarg's thinking around the nature and biodiversity and how to regenerate cities. So there was a lot of early thinking around that as well. This also motivated ecological urbanism. So it was but ecological urbanism didn't just deal with the landscape, it then dealt with built form and how that would be integrated into ideas like this around urban farming. So this is what Professor Mohsen Mostafavi, one of the earliest protagonists in the field, suggested, that the urban as the site of complex relations, economic, political, social and cultural, requires an equally complex range of perspectives and responses that can address both current conditions and future possibilities. And he suggests that this joining of ecology and urbanism can provide the knowledge, methods and clues about how the urban can respond under these conditions of what we now find ourselves in, which at that time was climate change, but now we're into this climate emergency. Now, this is very much a developed world problem, in the sense that you can see from this graph that per capita, the United States is the biggest polluter, and there you go, Australia is second, and our population is very small by comparison. So this is really very concerning. So Mostafavi suggests that why we need to embrace all this thinking around ecological urbanism is that basically since 1987, when the Brundtland report, which was the first kind of tangible report around issues of sustainable development was coined, that basically the US failed to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and Canada and all the Gulf countries equally did nothing about their carbon dioxide emissions, equally Australia. And so therefore this sort of complacency has continued, and now we're at a stage where it's an emergency. So what Mostafavi says is that sustainable architecture in itself has a sort of bad reputation, and he's sort of in terms of it being rudimentary, basic, it seems to not invite investment and to be taken seriously in many ways. So he sees this as part of the problem with the fact that there's not other options to the public or to the kind of elite, if you like, the ones that usually fund, in particular, residential architecture. This is a problem that, you know, sustainable design hasn't really delivered on the possibilities that there is available to it. It hasn't produced an architecture, in his view, which I sort of don't necessarily agree with, that really prompts the masses to embrace it. So this is a problem, because not only with the issue of the architecture itself, it's this issue of long-term food security, because the impacts of large-scale urbanization means that what was potentially traditional farming land and able to support the immediate population per country no longer can do this. And it's interesting, when working in Indonesia, I know that, for example, when I was last in Bali, for example, Bali can't support its own rice needs with its current arable land. So it actually has to import rice at, I'm not sure if this is all the time, or if this is just on, you know, at certain peak seasons, but the land area isn't sufficient and the current farming technology is not sufficient to support its current population. So really, what does this mean for the future, and what can ecological urbanism do as an architectural response, and how might it inform the farms of the future that potentially are designed by in collaboration with architects? So this is a 2011 world population figure of 7 billion, and this is this whole thing of this fine relationship between overpopulation and sustainability, and how is this scale, if it's continuously increasing, going to, if we're already struggling to feed the current population, how is it going to be supported in the future? So this whole demographic growth continues to pose really serious challenges, and effectively the world population has more than tripled in size, and some populations, such as sub-Saharan Africa and Western Asia, have increased 500% or more over the past 7 decades. So these sorts of population explosions are somehow, they're having to be fed, housed, clothed, etc. So this has caused, in urbanization terms, the evolution of the megacity. And here we're looking at Mexico City, which is this was back in 2010, 20.4 million people, and it was the most populous city in North America. Now, just quickly, I want to show you a little video, it's 3 minutes, around what, you know, potentially a farm of the future might look like and how it might address more large-scale farming and more intensive farming practices. So bear with me to show you this.
In the next 35 years, we'll have to produce more food than all of the world's production combined over the last 2,000. So what will the farms of the future look like? Well, they're unlikely to look like this just yet, but many of the sci-fi looking elements are already on the way. Take automation. These concept robots are being designed to autonomously scout, sense, and treat invasive pests and pathogens with micro amounts of herbicide or pesticide, vastly reducing the cost and environmental impacts associated with these chemicals. This is known as precision farming, and see here how the lasers on this tractor can detect the presence of weed to only treat affected areas. And this is the Ladybird rover, a working solar-powered prototype that conducts autonomous farm surveillance, mapping, and weed detection. Drones are also tipped to play a big role in the farms of the future, like this octocopter at Rothamsted Research. This BVSRC-funded demonstrated technology could help the farmers of the future measure growth and biomass and detect stresses to crops from pathogens or lacks of nutrients or water. Other researchers are already using them for surveillance, sowing seeds, and even to find or herd farm animals, as you can see here. Vehicles like these utilize the latest advanced sensors, and the farms of the future will be packed with them. Multi and hyperspectral cameras, for example, can see problems that the human eye just can't, and want 24 hours a day, feeding data back to shared cloud services for analysis and action. And it doesn't have to cost a fortune. Even now, a lot of this data can be gathered, calculated, or uploaded by smartphone upgrades and apps, meaning the benefits can be cost-effective and realized quickly in developing countries too. Tomorrow's global farms will therefore be key users of the Internet of Things, whereby vehicles and equipment can use GPS and Wi-Fi to talk to each other, connect with weather and pest forecasts. As for the farms themselves, the future farms might not all be on the ground, but under it instead, or integrated with factories, businesses, and harnessing local energies and opportunities. The farms of the future will also make use of data from large-scale experiments, such as the BVSRC-funded Northwick Farm Platform and the Scannalyzer. Then there is the National Plant Phenomics Centre, also funded by BVSRC. To feed the planet in an increasingly globalised food system, and in the face of climate change and extreme weather, we'll need elements of all this amazing technology, and more. BVSRC-funded researchers are working with partners and collaborators across the world to realise this vision.
Yeah, so, this introduction into vertical farming that the video was just talking about is really a response to this lack of land area, this inefficient way in many ways of large-scale farms, horizontally organized, where intensive hydroponics and all those sorts of technologies in a vertical farm might be able to, more sustainably cater for this sort of extensive population. So here we see a whole bunch of points around how to tackle this idea of vertical farms from a kind of conceptual perspective. The other thing about what is occurring in terms of this sort of population overload and the kind of context of the city is that then things start to break down, because the centralized systems are used to, like rubbish collection, for example, here in Naples, has broken down because there's been some sort of systematic issue within the everyday functioning of the city. It means that streets are impassable, the city can't be utilized. This is this kind of issue that large-scale urban metropolises face, and I know, for example, in Jakarta there's only certain areas of Jakarta that are serviced centralized by rubbish collection. Other areas are reliant on informal waste pickers and the different sorts of little social enterprises that constitute rubbish collection on multiple levels. So in some ways, Jakarta has kind of got it more organized through those informal sector plus the centralized system than in some other cities where they're totally reliant on centralized systems. So this is really interesting, because this is where, you know, the systems of the city have to be cater for these large scale populations. So obviously that's going to, with this rapid urbanization, there's going to be more of a limitation on global resources, and this is the way we need to deal with this sort of idea of scale differently than we have done in the past, because this is unprecedented sorts of scale issues confronting the modern metropolis. So this is where ecological urbanism comes in to suggest some ways about how this might be imagined for future cities, and it's already starting. Like, so for example, these buildings, large-scale buildings with green walls, this is something that's now become kind of commonplace amongst many cities, whereas, you know, 20 years ago you were struggling to find a green wall in any particular urban environment. So things are starting to change, and this is something Mostafavi was hoping for. But then there's this kind of other funny dynamic that's occurring. Now, obviously, this is an image of Shanghai superimposed on the desert. So this is the kind of photo montage of how the kind of, whilst ecological urbanism can potentially provide, say, a city with its own means of energy supplies through solar farms and rooftop photovoltaics, then you get this situation where you've got large sort of urban densities reliant on the sun, say, for example, but they're situated in a desert which can't sort of support other infrastructure like water that is going to provide for the city. So so in many ways, technology is developing so that urbanization on this mass scale can exist, but equally the environmental context has become really challenging because of the climate emergency and also from theoretically overpopulation. Now, Mostafavi also draws a lot on the French theorist Félix Guattari's notion or conceptual idea of the three ecologies, which he calls, which has a political overtone, and he calls it ecosophy. This is this kind of holistic approach to environmental issues where there's sort of three ecological registers: the environment, social relations, and human subjectivity. So therefore, also there's a responsibility shift from not just the political environment, but onto the individual to reconsider their behavior in the context of the city and how they might affect change even at an individual or local level, which may seem insignificant to the individual, but en masse creates behavior change over time. And this is where we're already starting to see this 10 years on from where ecological urbanism started in 2010. So there's this kind of idea that a new paradigm might come into play where humans and their social interactions enable a new way of shaping the environment. And this is where designers come in terms of how they might rethink the way sociocultural conditions play out in the city. So, and how they might be designed and how they're built structures might respond to this large-scale urbanisation. So therefore, I would sort of argue that ecological urbanism does not remove the parameters and the restrictions of modern planning, but it does seek to redress, to a certain respect, within the existing legislative framework, the divide between ecologies and the urban. So it's trying to merge, it's not a natural environment, it's a created ecology into the built context of the city. And here we see this, for example, in the New York skyline development, which was old infrastructure that was turned into an urban park sitting above the city. So this has replaced this old rail corridor, and it's sort of activating an old infrastructure, but contributing to the greening and the kind of environmental quality of the city. Other solutions, this one is a vision from Andre Brunsey, and this is the process of moving away from those typological conventions of the old city. And here the city is this fluid movement between public space, and it's seamless. There's this kind of encouragement of the pedestrian to walk through the city into these sorts of artificial ecologies, but nonetheless contributing to a lot less of a car-dominated society. Now, with my students, this was actually back in 2016, I introduced them to ecological urbanism as we were doing a studio on homelessness. Now, this is another aspect of the modern city or the contemporary city, is that despite this massive overpopulation and large-scale building projects, we have this increase in homelessness. People without, accommodation in the kind of contemporary city. Now, obviously in Indonesia, it's a kind of different situation in many ways, that the informal settlements cater for some of the population that can't find accommodation in the same, if they don't have jobs, like in the urban context. So it's a little bit different compared to the Australian condition. But my students had to embrace this idea because the idea was to redevelop a homeless centre with a whole bunch of facilities designated to basically getting people without accommodation back into the workforce so that they could continue actively participating in society how they did prior to becoming homeless. So, but there was this kind of fundamental approach that ecological urbanism adopts, which is that public space, private and public space within the city, there should be this kind of shift where there should be spaces available on private land that give places of shelter to the general public. Whether they're homeless or not is not the issue, but this creates a better urban environment, but by having shelter and plantings and attractive urban space and landscape space. So it's not just to the benefit of people that don't have accommodation, it's actually to the benefit of the environment, because by greening space in the urban realm, you're adding in trees, contributing to a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, and you're connecting into the existing, in Adelaide this is, the existing parkland structure. So this project here is by one of the students, Ben and Dari, and you can see how the green space is actually coming into the building as well, into the sections. So it's it's sort of an inside outside kind of scenario. And these are some, sorry, of the quality of the drawings. But here you can see in the sections how there's a real play with the interior space to encourage different uses of the space as well. So it's a rethinking of the way we design interior space to address the issues that are confronting the urban realm as well. So occupancy is it's less about private public ownership, it's more about rethinking how that might work and bring the environment in, but it also brings the public in to private space, which is completely crazy idea for a capitalist society. So, and this is another example by Jeremy Pierce, where he has really focused on totally revegetating the site with native plantings, because these are because in Adelaide traditionally the urban environment, once it was decimated for urban planning, was replanted with English trees or European trees, which need a lot of water and are currently sort of unsustainable proposition in today's climate emergency. So native plants that are less reliant on water is really important. And these are some other images. This particular student, Yasmin, she looked at biophilic, the idea of biophilic architecture and how you bring plants into the building to create, which you need a lot of light. So she's got all these high level lighting and side lighting and things to create the growth or encourage the growth of plants within the building. So this was very much something that my students were looking at in 2016. Now I just want to show you one other series of projects. One of my favorite architects, French architect Vincent Calabao, and his 2050 vision for Paris. So all of his propositions is the park and the greenery and the created ecology takes over the building. It's the opposite to the way we think about building in the city, where the buildings are dominant and it's just a concrete jungle. Well, here the buildings are planted out with all different types of food production plants to really important plants for the sort of creating a microclimate for the occupants of the building. And so the planting eventually is supposed to overtake the building. So this is a bit of a take on the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, where this really massively dense structures take over, in a way, the old city of Paris. And these, not only is it the planting, but there's all these different water treatment systems, wastewater treatment systems within the building. There's photovoltaics that are generating energy. So it's really a self-sustaining structure. And passive heating and cooling are occurring. There's rainwater recycling and air monitoring systems that are enabled by plants. So it's quite a sort of straightforward way of thinking, just planting out your building with a kind of ecology, its own ecology, which creates this kind of environmental filtering process for polluted cities, such as Paris. And there's a lot of emphasis on connectivity, because obviously the density of these towers is fairly substantial. So people are predominantly moving vertically within the towers, but there's also this connectivity at different levels at the street with sufficient urban design structures for shade and protection, but it's effectively a completely greened space, a really public expression of a kind of urban garden. Now, within the different design structures, there's different ways of generating energy. So for in this case, there's solar energy generators that harvest sunlight and produce biofuel. And yeah, this is all in because the vertical arrangement of space means that there's a lot of mixed use development going on, from residential, office buildings, retail, etc., institutional, educational, within one structure. So the movement and the need to go beyond this kind of high density development is minimized because everything's available on site. Not everything, but a lot of, you know, everyday needs. Okay, now I'm going to quickly jump to Indonesia because I see this show your colors in Jogja as one of the examples of the way informal settlement, because I was talking about homelessness before in the Adelaide context. Now, how informal settlement in a way has really responded to these sorts of difficult issues that are facing our cities. And I love this case in Jogja. So obviously most of you probably know all about this, but I'm just wanting to give a local example, is that you know, the original reason for the showing your colors idea, as I understand it from my reading, is that this was to sort of reject the advertising of the tobacco industry originally. This is how it was reported, at least in 2017 in one of the Jakarta papers. And so by painting all these kind of murals and painting the buildings meant that the tobacco industry couldn't really take ownership of those sorts of public spaces for their advertising. But equally, I understood it when I was in Jogja, is that the idea was also to show the local government that this kind of pride and care that the local community was taking in their buildings and their immediate environment, and how they were really keen to maintain their houses to a certain aesthetic level, to show that even though this might be a so-called informal settlement, it was very much a meaningful development and a very important development to generations of people actually that live in this particular location in Jogja in Kali. So the other thing about these settlements is this sort of focus on small scale little biodiversity farming. So here you can see some little pot plants in the bottom left along the banks of the river. There's also this advocacy for cleaning up the river with any rubbish and planting out, you know, your little small community gardens with banana palms and other little planting of small scale vegetable patches along the river. And then interestingly, and of course because of Indonesian climate, is that this kind of planting start to take over in many cases in this context. So a greening occurs without any major investment by anyone else to maintain the landscape. And this is really kind of ecological urbanism at its best, where the city starts to be subsumed by these kind of, let's say, maverick plantings because they were informal plantings. So in a way, sort of countries such as Indonesia, and specifically because of their climate, enables this kind of approach to future urban development. It's just when it's cleaned up and taken away and seen as unattractive that's when the problem starts. And that's what happens in Australia, for example. Informal plantings or informal settlement is just clearly not allowed. So here I've just got some close-ups of some of the little urban gardens and really little mini urban farms. Obviously, ecological urbanism is really seriously taking into account large-scale farming, because the problem is not just feeding the immediate environment or the immediate population. It's about, can you see me, or have I yeah, just got that. You can still hear me? Yes, Alita?
Yes, yes.
It's good? Okay.
Yes,
I think it dropped out. And so, yeah, so these are some examples. Now, in summing up, I just want to, so here's some other examples. On the other side of the river, or the bridge actually, away from this settlement, you can see this kind of large urban density, and the quality of the river is a lot worse in terms of not the same attention has been paid to this side of the river. It's quite interesting. Okay, so to come back to this idea of ecological urbanism and why is it important, even 10 years on from when it first was sort of raised by Mohsen Mostafavi and his team, I think that it's really critical to constantly revisit these processes that in some way can make a positive contribution to this idea of a climate emergency that we find ourselves in. And any reference to ecological environments means there's some sort of benefit to the human condition, because ecologies are naturally occurring and affect change in air quality, microclimates, and heat island effects that are a part of the large-scale urban environment. So in many ways, by coming back to these ideas, it's around sort of taking some sort of personal responsibility and potentially enabling these small-scale movements to occur within your immediate residential complex. This is something that if everybody did that and didn't take down all the trees and replanted trees and planted their urban gardens, even if they live in a residential tower, they made their balconies full of green plants, any of this kind of small-scale contribution will affect the air quality and the ability to live in the city in a much more productive and healthy way. I think the other thing is about really being conscious of consumption, and the more people can grow their own plants and consume, even if it's only herbs and a small amount of vegetables from their balcony garden, this is still making a contribution to the issues around food security that are occurring on a large scale in the urban environment. So in summary, I think ecological urbanism still resonates. It hasn't been adopted to the sort of scale that was envisaged in the 2010 and previously, but I think it has a lot of merit within the current kind of conditions that we're experiencing. So here's some other references that you might want to look at that also go into more detail about the urban farming, and also sort of the initiatives that prompted ecological urbanism out of the American condition. And so that is where I'm going to end for today, and any questions would be really great. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Julie. It's a very interesting idea. It's very interesting conversations as well, because it's very relevant to our conditions right now.
Indeed, yes. A lot of, I think there's, as far as I understand it, in Nafal was telling me that in Indonesia there's a little bit of urban farming going on.
Yes, it's true. There's more people doing urban farming, as well as, I don't know, there's a lot more people as well currently into, how do you say it? It's more like not fishing, but what do you say this? Like having a fish pad.
Oh, like a fish farm, like a little fish farm.
It's not as for farming, it's more for aesthetic. So most
Oh,
of them are actually like a very tropical beauty, very, very unique fishes,
oh, yeah.
and sell that again to other people's. But it's another form of business type, but somehow it's quite booming currently in Indonesia as well.
Okay. That's
Farming as well as I've heard lots about how do you say this in English? I don't know, but you know, uh, plants for just to, it's not for eating, it's not for consumptions, but it's for beautifications.
Yeah, aesthetic purposes.
Yes,
Yeah.
aesthetic plants like that. It's also quite booming here. Even it's so booming that there's some couple of news saying some a thief stealing that plants.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it feels more, I don't know. There's a lot more domestic businesses going around, more people cooking at home and selling them as well. And I really like your conclusions at the end that there's a movement that we should allow that, even though it's just a small movement, but it going around in our immediate community, and that will be very, very great for ecological urbanisms as well.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency, particularly in Australia. I don't know how people feel in Indonesia, but that you can't. That the problem is so significant that there's nothing that can be done. So the sort of appreciation of how the individual can make small changes sometimes gets lost, like in the meta narrative around the problems of the climate emergency. And I think I think the waste pickers, for example, in Indonesia is a really good example of how even at Bantar in just out of Jakarta, isn't it? That how like that's a thriving community. I mean, obviously, it's a challenging community, but it's a whole enterprise around something that is giving a really positive contribution to society in general because it's minimizing landfill.
Yes, true. And there's a lot more like that in Indonesia. I'm kind of curious about that because here in Indonesia, we some of us kind of do recycle by ourselves. No, not recycle. How do you say it? Like you mentioned before, like reprocessing, repurposing materials from landfills because well, mostly there's people doing it individually, like filling up all of not filling up, like selecting all those how do you say this? The domestic waste, either it's plastic, metals, etc., and then they can distribute it to the different people who needs it. I'm kind of wondering in Australia if that is that possible to be occurred or
is it that happens all the time in terms of, but we've got what happens with individuals is a bit different because we've actually got centralized systems that deal with this, so that in many ways the responsibility is taken off the individual because all you have to do is put it in your bin and it gets taken away.
Yeah.
So yeah, it actually shifts responsibility. So recently in Australia, a lot of our recycled materials like plastics, paper, etc., was being shipped to China for processing, and then at one time. I think this was like a year or two ago, China, for whatever reason, stopped taking our recycled materials for, I think there was political reasons, and as a result we had no backup plan. Like there was no I mean, now industry has sort of come on board and started to recycle and make new products out of recycled materials more so on site, like as in Australia. But yeah, at that point, everything was going to landfill because China stopped taking our waste. Like this is this kind of idea of shifting responsibility, and this is very problematic in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, sorry, my cat. Perhaps there's a questions from the audiences because it's really interesting. I'm sorry, my cat is so noisy.
No worries.
Because yeah, I also remember that I'm not sure about Australian notes, but I remember British Sterling, the notes one. It was created from a recycled plastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the same things with Australia as well?
I mean, there are recycled products, but they're often, I mean, there are small businesses that have started recycling products in Australia as making a sort of social enterprise out of those ideas. But still, we're reliant on large scale manufacturing occurring offshore, which has its own problems with the sort of ecological footprint associated with shipping things offshore and then re-importing them. So yeah, it's kind of wasteful in that respect. But because labour is very expensive in Australia, this is why that it's an economic argument. It's not a environmental argument.
Yeah. Speaking about positions, well, because you mentioned about some arguments, and I was wondering, in your opinion, as an architect, both as professional as well as academics, how do you think, in what degree or how far can we promote this, ecological urbanism? Because if we are talking as a professional, because we have clients, and sometimes we're kind of dictated by what clients want. Or as academics, well, academics I think is much more flexible in terms of promoting ecological urbanisms or sustainability in architecture. But yeah, I was wondering about your idea about that.
Well, I think it's just like any kind of key ideas or design ideas with clients in particular. You always have to try and sell your idea. So the client inevitably does come to you, usually commercial or residential clients come to you with a preconceived idea about what they think they want from you. So but of course they're not trained typically in architectural design, so it's your job as the architect to sell the idea, which often can't be sold in terms of how we discuss, colleague to colleague. So you have to kind of repitch it or reframe it. I think it's the same with ecological principles and sustainable principles around design. So and you have to always know your audience. So with some clients, they're very receptive to, for example, a life cycle costing discussion. So if they're going to be owner occupiers of a building over 50 years, they don't plan to develop and on sell, they're quite receptive to the idea usually around this is going to save you a lot of money over the lifetime of your building. Your capital cost might be higher because sadly at this point in time, usually sustainable development in terms of materials and initial outlay is often more expensive than non-sustainable practices, unfortunately. But most clients are keen to save money on their long-term user costs, so power bills, etc. So I find that in my experience when I was still working as an architect, now almost 7 years ago, I found that clients were very receptive if they were going to take ownership of that building and or their families were for long periods of time. They'd be really open to thinking, how can they make the most efficient building envelope to support their activities and their long-term activities. It's a harder sell to clients that are planning to rent out the premises or develop and move on. But these days, Green Building Council of Australia, for example, provides an Energy Star rating for commercial properties that is an incentive for developers to meet minimum standards for energy efficient functioning. But that's minimum standards. So that is in no way capitalizing on the technologies that we have to produce really high performance structures. So I think the issue of life cycle, what we call life cycle costing, is a big incentive for clients depending on what their role is with the building after it's finished.
All right. That's really interesting, because I don't think we have that incentive systems in Indonesia. So I feel like although there's a lot more excuse me, although there are lots more developers a bit more conscious about sustainability, about green buildings, how it should be eco-friendly and everything, but well, I'm not sure, because lots of them as well are kind of use sustainability and green building as a gimmick. In Indonesia, I feel like it's something like that. I don't know, but there's a couple of positive movements, so I hope it's getting better.
That definitely happens here as well. Like we call it greenwashing.
Oh wow!
Like
just put greens on the buildings.
Yeah,
Call it green building.
Yeah, it's just like a kind of facade that the building is, environmentally responsive when it's not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Perhaps we have some questions from the participants.
Yeah, Julie, I would like to ask about question regarding the sustainability in terms of the historical building or the heritage structure, preservation or conservation. So as what Elita has actually mentioned just now, that the word sustainability, well, there was a time when this word actually was valuable, but it has been vastly evolved into an kind of overused buzzword or related with so many aspects of architectural design. But I think when we talk specifically about how to conserve or safeguard the historical heritage, not only about building, but also in the level of urbanism. Yeah. Actually, we talk about sustainability when we preserve those structure, how to sustain those values, authenticity, as well as its physical appearance, right? So regarding the issue of sustainability in terms of the invention of new technology and its relationship with the green approach to the environment. How can we elaborate these two different disciplines, but actually they talk about the similar vision in sustaining the built environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Musab. So the terminology is in English, I guess. The way sustainability is understood in English is that exactly what you're saying. It's sustaining something. Now, at this point in time, we need to be more proactive. I think back in the 1980s, when this Brundtland Commission defined ecologically sustainable development, there was not this kind of same urgency around making really wholesale change to human behavior. So I think with all good intentions, this notion of sustainability, if we built sustainably and sustained kind of status quo at that point in time, then perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation. But now, because that wasn't really taken terribly seriously, and we are in a situation where, you know, this global warming and all these things means that now there has to be sort of a shift or a acceleration of alternative practices that's where regenerative architecture and that movement of regenerative architecture is talking about giving back to the environment, whereas sustainability implies that we're just sustaining it at the current practices because everything's okay and we can maintain it. Whereas contrary, now it's a case of we have to affect change through the built environment to make substantial inroads into carbon dioxide emissions, global warming, etc. So there's a whole bunch of really interesting practices out there that look at on probably a smaller scale than, you know, like I showed Vincent Calabao's work, but like Mike Reynolds' Earth ships. Have you heard of them?
About what? Sorry?
Mike Reynolds' Earth ships from he looks at this kind of way of building in the desert, and he uses tires, pounded tires, to make retaining walls and thermal mass. But in addition to his ideas, he introduces other passive systems to treat wastewater, to collect, make energy efficient buildings out of solar collection. But this is on a much smaller sort of scale than a high rise or anything. So, but the principles involved in what he is proposing could be adopted on a large scale building. It's just a design and engineering task around how that might work. So there's plenty of, but so this is kind of interesting because my students this year, I was teaching an environment studio, and they were all really keen to know about what the cutting edge energy high-tech solutions are to addressing our energy problems. And I said, actually, there's a much bigger movement back to passive design principles, vernacular building ideas, not obviously with contemporary materials, but how you design buildings to have smaller footprints, cross ventilation, solar entry, so you don't need lights on all the time, daylight entry, high level lighting, so you've got different forms of daylight coming into your building. You're not just having large expanses of glass that are, you know, creating energy problems. There's all those sorts of passive design principles that can be adopted on a much more cost-effective way than all these high-end, high-tech energy solutions.
Yes, that's true. That's actually one of my pet peeves, because when people talk about vernacular or traditional architecture, they immediately think about, I don't know, like less prehistoric something. But in turns, it's actually very relatable with the context, with the climate situations in that particular area, and that's really actually can be a very good base for a sustainability knowledge. I mean, that would be very great.
Yeah, so also I think that that really the answer, we have the answers. We just have to find ways of implementing them on a much larger scale than what they ever used to do previously, because we didn't have high-rise buildings back in the 18th century or whatever. So, or we didn't have this population mass in a really small land area. Yeah, so I think the answers are already with us. It's just a way of thinking through how to manage them, as well as getting people to, because what we always say is a passive designed building is occupied by active participants. So they have to open windows when it's hot. They have to close or to get cross ventilation, or when at night, and get the building to cool down. During the day when it's hot, they have to shut the windows to stop the hot air getting in, and it has to be a well insulated building, and it has to have a landscape around it to cool, or in the case of Vincent Calabao's work, in it. They have to have landscape as part of the environment. So yeah, I think we have the answers.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Musha, for the questions. Perhaps we can have, there's one more question from Ricky Purbaya. He asks that, he wrote it in Indonesia, so I will translate it a little bit. Is there a city in Australia that's already implementing the idea of ecological urbanism?
Not on a large scale. So in Victoria, in Melbourne, there's already buildings that are built in high-rise cross-laminated timber structures. So these are really high-performance engineered structures that are way more sustainable than using a concrete frame and frame and pier construction, and slab construction. So yeah, this is something actually now, because there is a really a more of a push and a motivation through what I was speaking about before, the Green Building Council of Australia, this initiative to encourage commercial builders and commercial clients to have this Energy Star rating. The cross-laminated timber industry is now putting a factory in South Australia, where I live, because there's a large timber industry in the southeast of my state. So there's gradual change and investment in these sorts of technologies that are providing much better performing commercial buildings. Because do you know much about cross-laminated timber panels? And do you guys, because I don't know if it's very common in Indonesia. It's very common in Europe. It's called CLT for short.
CLT.
Do you know? I don't know if you guys know much about it. You do, Ricky?
I said yes. The one like in, yeah.
Well, yeah. So this form of building is starting to take off in Melbourne. Oh, McLean Point. Yeah. But it's still not common practice. Like there's not. So to answer your question, no, there's no city that's completely embracing this idea of ecological urbanism. There's individual developers or clients that want to do it because it makes sense, and again, it's a cost-saving exercise over time.
Cost saving, yeah. Ricky, do you have any response or perhaps further questions about that? No? All right. So, she said thank you.
You're welcome.
That's very interesting. I mean, about all of these ideas about ecological urbanism, which is, I think, is really, really important for us right now because, like you said before, it should be it good for our future, not just particularly a particular city or a country, but it's actually good for the whole, well, Earth. I think for its very, very maybe it's not eliminating, but it could alleviate a little bit about climate change. It could help. And with the pandemic, I remember when I was discussing with my friend, she's from urban planning, that with the current pandemic situations, it actually make the city even smaller in terms of it's more connected to our community. It's much more intimate. City is much more intimate. Like you mentioned before, Julie, about and when we're talking about urban farming, it's not just feeding yourself, but it could also feed the whole community. Or even you can go a little bit farther to 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 the next community. But basically, it will it will reduce carbon footprint, which is very nice for the earth right now. And I think, yeah, we should think a bit more more, I don't know, more intimate, perhaps more immediate community. We can start from a very, very small step. You can start from yourself, or as we talked before, you can start if you're in professional architects, or if you are all of your students in architecture. We can start by implementing that idea to our designs, to our clients, and I think it would be a very, very um, positive actions as an architect.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you very much, Julie, for a very, very interesting presentations. I hope that everybody else also enjoying the presentations as well. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you very much.
All right, as usual, before we end this session, I would like to all participants to turn on their camera. As usual, we will have a, how do we say it? It's not a selfie anymore, isn't it? What is it? A screenshot?
Okay.
We will have a group screenshot. It's not a selfie anymore. Perhaps Kamushak will help us with this.
Yeah, so please for all the participants to open the respective video camera. So most of the participants are coming from the studio students of design.
Is that right?
They specialize in the heritage unit, the
the
final
heritage.
year student. Yeah.
Is that Prof. Kemas's student?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, they are. Yeah. Okay, so please for Fairuz, Mona Lisa, and Taufik. Well, I think some of them have left the meeting prior to the, yeah. They leave when the facilitator was, missing. Right. Okay, I'm about to do the screenshot, so please now open your video camera. Uka, Virus, Mona, right. Okay, counting to 1, 2, 3. Right, done. Thank you.
Yay! Thank you very much, Musab. Thank you for hosting this, Musab. And thank you very much, Julie, for a very interesting talk.
Thank you very much, Lila. Okay, we'll be in touch.
We will.
All right.
Will you?
Yeah, see you, Julie.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
The video will be available in the channel of Department of Architecture, FTUI. Yeah.
Immediately?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Immediately after this recording.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's
Nice.
very efficient.